Welcome back to the kitchen at Andersen Acres. Today we're going to be making rye bread. Rye bread is my favorite of all the breads, and I love a lot of breads. I love its depth of flavor. I just adore rye bread. Now I'm going to be making rye bread with a third of my flour will be rye flour, 2/3 are going to be white flour. You can work with more rye flour, but rye flour tends to make your loaves dense and heavy, so I use the white flour to puff it up and make it still an appealing texture for me. You can change your ratios a little bit. If you do increase your rye flour, you're going to have to increase your water. Rye flour is very, very thirsty. All right, so if you increase your rye flour, increase your water. So let's get started. First ingredient, we are going to do 1 1/4 cup of warm water. The extra 1/4 cup is because it's a thirsty dough. 2 tablespoons of butter. Now you can use a margarine if you like. I use butter in my breads, always. 1 tablespoon of sugar, just regular sugar. 1 teaspoon of salt. You can use kosher, table salt, or whatever. I use Himalayan. 1 cup of rye flour, just 1 cup. 2 cups of white flour. See if we can do this without spilling. Probably not. Well, mostly. And then finally, we have 1 heaping teaspoon of yeast. I'm using bread machine yeast. If you're doing this by hand, you want to use traditional yeast and pre-dissolve it. That is our recipe. This is just going to go in the bread maker. At every stage, rye bread's going to need a little bit more time to rise. So during its first rise, it usually rises for an hour for regular bread. For rye bread, I'm going to give it an hour and a half. So an hour is not enough just for rye bread because it's annoying. I love rye bread. It's an annoying bread. So this one, it's going to mix for about half an hour, mix and knead and all that stuff to get the dough firmed up. Then it's going to rise for an hour and a half. So we'll be back in about 2 hours to check on our progress. All right, so here's our rye dough. It's looking quite nice. It's quite flexible, quite soft. And that's the way it should be. So what we're going to do is we're not going to use a bread pan for this because rye dough does tend to have pretty good structure. So we're just going to pinch it together like this, and there's a little bit of dough in my hand, and shape it into an oblong loaf. We're not going to go too long because you end up with a really tiny loaf. So we're going to go about a little bit longer than a bread pan, maybe, so about like that, maybe about 12 inches. I'm lucky I've got a 12-inch circle right in front of me because this mat has all the measurements. So I know that that's 12 inches long, so about 12 inches for me. You could go a little bit longer if you wanted. And we're just going to place it directly on a baking pan. So I'm just using my cookie sheet. And we're just going to set it aside now, since we've punched all the air out and we've shaped it into a nice loaf. We're going to set it aside for 60 to 90 minutes. Okay, because this is going to need a lot of time to puff up and we don't want to rush it. So check it after 60 to see if it has doubled in size roughly, but be prepared to leave it for 90. Rye flour does sometimes resist rising. So we'll come back and check on it in 60 to 90 minutes. All right, so our rye bread is risen up nice and puffy. You see it maintains its structure, it doesn't glob all over your pan. Now I'm going to coat mine with a milk wash. This is just milk. You don't have to actually make a wash, you just get some milk and do that. I do this because I like my rye bread to have a softer crust, and milk encourages a softer crust. So I'm using milk. You can use, if you like nothing, you can just bake it as is. You can also use an egg wash, which will give you a shinier crust, especially if it's egg white only. Okay, so you can also, after you bake it, you can do a brush it with melted butter, so a butter wash after it's baked. I wouldn't do a water wash. You can sometimes do a water wash to get a crisper crust, but rye bread can be really, really tough. So it's not a great idea because it could give you a really crunchy crust and you don't necessarily want that in a rye bread, though it is up to you. Now I'm going to diagonally slash, and I'm going to go deep enough that when it puffs, when it rises in the oven, it doesn't bust out the side. So one, you can do however many, it depends how long your loaf is. I'm doing 3 gashes. 3. Now it's going to go in the oven. The oven is preheated to 375. It's going to bake for about 25 minutes, maybe 30, but I usually do 25 minutes. So 375 degrees for 25 minutes. Back in 25. So our bread has been baking for 25 minutes, and it should look just about like this. It's very, very hot. I keep burning my fingers. But it should look just about like that. It's a beautiful loaf, and I absolutely adore rye bread, so this is what I make most of the time. I like to let it cool 100% before I start cutting it, just because I like to use it for sandwich bread and toast. But of course, if you like hot bread, slice away after about 20 minutes. If you slice breads before that 20-minute cool down, they actually can collapse in on themselves, because technically, when it's this hot, it came out of the oven about 20 seconds ago. So when it's this hot, it is still technically cooking inside. So if you start cutting it now, the whole loaf could collapse. So give it 20 minutes to rest. It'll still be plenty hot 20 minutes from now. And then cut away and enjoy. So I hope you've really enjoyed making rye bread with me today. I hope you join us again. If you do want to see more videos like this, please like and subscribe, and we will do our best to keep baking for you. See you tomorrow.